I'm Michael Goldman. Welcome to another installment of Studio Daily's podcasts from the Front Line series, where each month we talk with filmmakers from various disciplines about their work on current major feature films. And this month our guest is Gaffer Martin Smith, who recently took charge of managing the electrical and lighting requirements of the new box office monster hit from director Christopher McQuarrie and Tom Cruise, Mission Impossible Fallout. The project traversed the globe from London to Paris, New Zealand, Norway, and Abu Dhabi, was largely shot on film using traditional tools and techniques and elaborate practical stunts, and posed reams of creative and logistical lighting challenges for Smith and his colleagues as they collaborated with McQuarrie and cinematographer Rob Hardy. Smith recently chatted with me about these challenges and what he learned on the project. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Martin, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
How's it going, Michael?
Great, and thank you. And I thought, the first thing to get into here is just a little bit of background, sort of the how and the why you got involved in this massive movie. Have you ever worked with Chris McQuarrie or Rob Hardy before, and had you ever been involved with the Mission Impossible franchise before?
Well, I've worked with Rob Hardy about 15 years ago on a small commercial. It was just a 2-day shoot, and it was very simple. But back then, I'd known of Rob Hardy. He'd been working his way up through the ranks of, small movies, large commercials, some promos, and I'd worked alongside another gaffer that used to work with Rob Hardy. So I got to know his style a little bit from, nearly 15 years ago. And Rob's a massive fan of tungsten lighting, steers clear of HMI lighting. It's quite an old school mentality of the way he makes movies and the way he lights movies. But I had worked with him, so I knew a little bit about Rob. Chris McQuarrie, I'd worked with on Edge of Tomorrow. I worked second unit Edge of Tomorrow with DP Fraser Taggart. And then we reshot probably a third, if not more, of Edge of Tomorrow when Chris McQuarrie came on board and helped rewrite some of the scenes from Edge of Tomorrow. We worked with Chris, and Fraser then became main unit gaffer for that period of time. So I know Chris pretty well. I'd worked with Rob a little bit back in the day. It was kind of a new structure, a new team that Chris wanted to form, and indeed Rob Hardy wanted to try a new gaffer, and we all wanted to try and get a new end result for the look and style of Mission. So that's where we all kind of came together at the initial start of this movie.
And if I understood right, I think Chris McQuarrie, who's returning for a second consecutive Mission Impossible movie, kind of wanted basically a different crew, not because there was anything wrong last time, but because the franchise had always had different directors, and since it was the same director, he wanted to make sure he could still achieve a different look. And so I thought maybe you could sort of give the quick overview of what the mission statement was, what the look was that those guys told you that they were trying to achieve with this movie.
Well, it's any movie that's going to involve Rob Hardy is going to have a certain style to it, certain quality. I think they knew once they'd looked at some of Rob Hardy's work that it was going to be a darker, edgier, sort of deeper looking movie. They wouldn't have picked Rob otherwise, and it was in the initial meetings with Rob when I realised we were going to make a different looking movie to Rogue Nation, because that was there's nothing wrong with that movie, but Chris McQuarrie was coming on board for his second mission, and he wanted a different look. He didn't want it to look like it's made by even the same director, let alone the same cinematographer. So it was at that point, the early meetings with Rob, when we talked about how dark and how far we could push this Mission Fallout. And I remember early in the meeting saying to Rob, look, I know your style and I know what you're saying, but we can't always leave Tom in the shadows. He's not going to like that. And we're going to have to battle to find the medium ground there, because he's the main star in this movie. He wants a different looking movie. Chris wants a different looking movie. Rob's going to definitely deliver a different looking movie, but we've got to be careful that we're not always putting him in the shadows. And we kind of batted around ideas of how that would look and how far we could, and were determined to push it. But I always knew Rob was going to push it further than most DPs would feel comfortable. And I think the end result of that, and fighting that a little bit with Chris McQuarrie on occasions on set, became quite an impressive looking movie. You know, with Rob's how far Rob was determined or willing to push it, we got the best end results, I think, without a doubt. So we discussed all this probably 15 weeks before we started shooting the movie. That was my prep time, I think 15 weeks. And it started to become apparent from the initial meetings that this was definitely going to be a different style altogether from Rogue or any other missions, indeed.
And we're going to get into some specifics on some of the big set pieces in a couple minutes. But, you know, as they sort of went over this stuff with you and you launched into prep, did you have a clear idea what exactly you were getting yourself into, the scope and the technical challenges and the international challenges of shooting this kind of a movie? Had you ever come close to doing anything at this level, previously?
I've shot a few different countries, but you know, it's always a few weeks here and there, much smaller scale. I'll be honest with you, this was the biggest movie that I've ever had to prep and prepare for, because it wasn't just the countries we were going to shoot in; it was the actual scale of the sets going into the countries and the design of the sets going into the countries. You know, it was something that I didn't want to look at as a whole picture at the time, and we slowly started to break it down into small, achievable chunks of work. We sort of isolated each country as an individual, call it arena, and then in those countries we then broke it down into sections using the local crew to be my main support, my main artery of communication. And it was not something that we were able to, you know, go and scout many times. Places like New Zealand, we didn't even go out there and scout. It was all done on plans and internet and face chats, FaceTimes. And so it was preparing it, but breaking it down into bite-sized chunks. It's definitely the biggest movie I've had to prepare for, albeit once we broke it down into the achievable sized chunks of work, it's a much nicer picture to look at a calendar when you know specific timings and when equipment's meant to be arriving and when your crew are starting and finishing. So, we broke it down almost into separate stages, but still a very overwhelming procedure based on the scale of the movie, the absolute amount of lighting that was going to be transported. Just for instance, down to Paris, you know, we had to plan and prepare our first location, which was the Grand Palais. Now, to start a movie on an interior of the scale of the Grand Palais, I don't know anyone that wouldn't be a little bit daunted, but we've got a really good team around us. And for me, working in these countries, it's about getting the right key players in the countries. You know, and I kind of just get a gauge on whether I think they're going to fit in with my crew, because we took a few key personnel, obviously, to these locations and countries. And we build up a picture, and it becomes quite apparent who, you know, is going to work well with the way we work. But also, we don't want to change their approach to filmmaking, because they're very talented. You know, in Paris, in New Zealand, in Norway, in Abu Dhabi, there's some very, very talented crew. And I think taking on the local crews, you're going to get a lot more respect, as in when you just fly your team out there and push them aside. So that was a very important part of the structure, getting to know the key players and interviewing the key players, and building the individual teams in the countries was paramount to me. That if we could get a great structure and a great Gaffer and Best Boy and Desktop and key players in each individual country, that was part of my breakdown, the structure of how we were going to make this work. The second issue is then making sure they have the amount of equipment we need. And for something like the Palais, I just didn't have a good feeling that, the Paris rental houses were going to supply on time the amount of LED lighting, moving lights, lasers, video walls, rigging equipment. So we had to make because it was so early on in the film and we hadn't worked with these guys before, we had to make a calculated guess that we'd take all the equipment from the UK down to the Palais, but anything exterior and any other works or photography around Paris, which there was a hell of a lot still to do, we'd use from the Paris rental houses. Now I know the country better and the equipment and the rigging. We could probably source it all from Paris, but we just didn't have time, and I didn't have the knowledge. So, we broke all these down into small bites, like Under the Canals in Paris, all the other interiors that we shot, the White Widows in Paris. And we broke Paris down into small, achievable chunks, albeit the Grand Palais was a 2-day, 60 crew lighting rig for us. And with regard to the UK electricians, we do all our own rigging. We don't have grips rigging for us. We rig all our own overheads or lighting trusses. But we do have a full support of a rigging team as well, but they would be electric rigging as opposed to grip electric rigging. So once we'd achieved and broken everything down into these achievable bite-sized chunks, it became a lot more bearable and not so overwhelming. And that's when you start to see a little light at the end of the tunnel, because your numbers, your labour flow and your man days calendars that you now have to do to satisfy all the accountants, and your equipment you've sourced, you've got your labour in place, you've got some key players, and it becomes a little bit more bearable. Then you push Paris aside and start to focus on New Zealand, and you go through the whole procedure again. In Paris, it became apparent to me that there was only going to be one guy that would fit the way our style of working, and he was a guy called Gregory Frementin, and we hit it off straight away. And he was so happy to be part of the franchise and come on board, and he grabbed every opportunity to make this a success. From the off, he got in his best boy and his rigging gaffer, who liaised with some of my team. I sent out a rigging gaffer, my desk op, and a few key personnel, and they worked to start planning this, on the building blocks that I'd put in place in the early stages. They then really built this and made this work. I took out quite a heavy practicals team, because at all the locations we had a lot of practical lighting. We had to build huge light rings and immense amounts of lights that go above the mirrors in the Palais, lots of details in the Palais set in itself. So we took some practical guys over, we took a few rigging guys, and the rest was really structured, apart from my best boy, my lighting desk operator, Dan Walters, my best boy, Lee Eldred, and my charge hand floor best boy, Gary Owen. The rest was structured using our local guys, and Gregory Frementin was the man that pulled that together for me over in Paris, and he done it very, very well. Moving then on, while they're preparing, I'm liaising with the guys in New Zealand. We had a guy who was fantastic, Jamie Cooper, who looked after all our set design out there. It was another huge practical installation that was the tent sequence. You'll see the tents in the movie where they're rushing through the tents in the Nepalese village with the UN sort of camp enclosure, and that was all shot in New Zealand. And before we went out there, I had a conversation with Jake Myers, the producer, and he said, we're never going to film the interiors of these tents. It's all going to be done back in London. And, you can't, producers are doing their job, but they've got one thing in mind. It's just to make it a success, but also they have to be aware that we don't waste money. But my thoughts on New Zealand were that we only have 6 hours of light to shoot in the day in New Zealand. As the sun came up one side of the mountains and dropped down the other side of the mountains, with a bit of magic hour, we were only into really 6.5 hours of available light to shoot all the helicopter sequences. Now, we've got a crew that's on a 10-hour deal or a 12 deal, whatever we were on at the time. And so I thought it was clever to take and light the interiors of the tents. Now, that meant us sourcing, I think it was 600 kilowatt of tungsten light and we used to travel up in the mornings and light this tented village up. We'd go up 2 hours early, get all the lighting out, so that when the crew arrived, they could shoot a couple of hours before sunrise in the tents, and then we'd pack it all up. They'd do the day exterior, and then in the afternoon, we'd get it all out again as the sun dipped. We could light the interiors of the tents. That was my kind of vision early on, and I had to convince Jake, the producer, that he'd thank me for this, making this available to shoot. So it was a calculated expense to source all the equipment and all the additional generators and all the practical elements, lighting that go inside the tented village. But it gave them an extra 2 or 3 hours of available shooting light each day. And in the actual movie, I think it's a pretty good looking part of the scene. But that was all shot at night for day. So I think things like this, when you're figuring out what it is you're actually doing in these countries, you also have to think a little bit outside the box on, a film crew's not going to give you 3 hours off each day just because there's no light. And that was our, time to step in and say, look, we can make this a little more bearable and that we can shoot some of the actors in the AM and as the sun sets in the afternoon. So that's what we did.
And to complicate matters even more, Rob Hardy's not a fan of LED lighting. This was a very traditional kind of method of filmmaking across the globe. The movie was shot on film. Maybe you could address a little bit, the challenge of having to move around and utilize, more of these traditional tools, maybe stay away from some of the more modern LED or other digital oriented type things. Why that was important to Rob, how you made that work without, pulling your hair out.
Well, we did pull our hair out. I have to say it was tough. It was really tough because all the modern tools that are available to filmmaking now are there for a good reason. They're environmentally friendly. They use less power. Possibly slightly easier to rig sometimes, but it wasn't Rob's vision, and I'm really glad that we didn't go with the modern look, the modern tools. It was hard. Every location. Rob's a big fan of having details behind actors, so any location we'd shoot on would be a huge practical element, but not necessarily as a lighting tool, more of a detail. We'd use a lot of straight linear fluorescent lighting. It was all done as corridors and long soft lights. We'd have to build into the set pieces, but we wouldn't be able to just go with sky panels now. We'd have to use either a tungsten softbox above, which we'd use to get our levels up, or we'd use fluorescent lighting in a hell of a lot of the movie. We've used fluorescent, hidden fluorescent lighting, which Rob likes to use in some of his softer box installations or as details, as practical elements. But even day exteriors, we'd have 20K mole beams as flares in some of the shots. Day exterior, you'd like to think you can use a bit of light control, but Rob likes to push in. If we're going to use some light as a key, it's almost, 100 kilowatt of tungsten bendy light would be his favourite tool. And we'd obviously half correct that, half blue, and diffuse it, and then when it looked a little hard, we'd diffuse it some more. So it's not just the front end; it's the cabling, the distribution, and the generation, and the manpower that's needed to support the tools Rob wanted to use. But we got a system in place where we'd always carry 20 quarter Wendy lights, which is a lot. They're 33,000 watt light fittings each, and we'd carried 20 run of show. That's without anything that's been rigged prior to us arriving. And on days we'd have 20 lights out and we'd build big soft walls of light. It's quite apparent in some of the scenes under the tree canopy where Tom's chatting with Rebecca. It looks stunning, but we built and lit, because the tree canopies were so heavy. Rob loves a low, soft wall of light, and he uses it all the time. But that, for that's we're getting out 20, 30 kilowatt Wendy lights, and we're triple diffusing them and adding a little bit of quarter blue, half blue, and we're creating that light, but we're bouncing it in off, big windbags or unbleached muslins, just to create some of that soft beauty light. And we'd get a bit and wrap it around the front of Rebecca's face and Tom's face. We had up to 4 generator plants for some of the day exterior scenes, and then that just grew in as we'd start to shoot location interiors. The lighting list that we carried and the rigging crew had to move around the countries was double that. It was always a big deal, but we achieved it with a lot of manpower and a huge support actually from production. once they started to see the end results of some of our tests and the Grand Palais, and they grew confident with our work and Rob's style, I think then they opened the wallet a little bit more to achieve some of the ideas that myself and Rob had collaborated to come together on. They then supported us with a bigger crew and much more plant and equipment, and then they realised, the end result was well worth the extra pennies.
And in terms of some of the specific set pieces in this movie, and there's a lot of them. I don't even know if we'll have time to go through all of them, but at least some highlights here. One that in a way may well be my favorite scene in the movie, even though it's not the biggest scene compared to a couple others, is the big fist fight in the white bathroom inside the Grand Palais. And I was just curious what lighting issues you had there. You had an all white set, you had mirrors, and a highly choreographed scene that may be the best fist fight I've ever seen in a movie. What was the key to making that work from a lighting perspective?
Well, I sat with Rob. We looked at the plans. We were shooting away in New Zealand, and we knew the bathroom set was coming up pretty soon after we'd arrived back from New Zealand. And we sat in an office, and I said, "Look, Rob, we're going to shoot this scene. They're building this set." We both agreed that it needed more light. There was a few set deck lights that the designer had come up with, Pete Wenham, and it was okay. But Rob was very adamant. This needed to be a stark contrast to the Palais, and it needed to be almost clinical looking, like no other bathroom set you've seen before. So we decided at that time we were going to build a wall of soft light above each section of the bathroom, and you can see it's apparent in the film. We built light wells. In fact, we actually built individual sections, and then once we got back to the UK, much to everyone's disgust, we doubled the amount of light in there. We knew we were going to shoot some high-speed sequences. We didn't want any flicker issues, so that's when we added the pelmet light that runs above the mirror and above the wash basins and the urinals. I said it'd be great because that detail is going to be in every shot. Although we've got this beautiful soft light, we can then have a detail. And Rob's a big fan of having a detail of some sort. Once again, it was fluorescent lighting, which worked very well. Yeah, so Rob's vision was then to have a practical element always in the back as a detail. So we decided to put pelmet lighting above the urinals and the wash basins. That was also fluorescent lighting, back to our dimmer control, always back to the iPad, back to the lighting desk. The top lights were six ways of 4-foot fluorescent lighting that we changed. We bought some as a off-shelf product, just changed the ballast so we could control the dimming levels in there, the actual levels. And then some of it was actually already timber framed, so we had to make our own lights using some metal that we formed and shaped to match the precast ones that were already installed in the set. We actually caused myself a big headache when we doubled the amount of lighting in there because there was nowhere then to fit the lighting. So we had the construction, had to knock out joists and restructure the ceiling. But the end result is every stressful moment to get that extra lighting in there, and Rob's soft panelled lighting that runs the length of both sections of the bathroom. It was well worth it. And it's actually one of Rob's favourite scenes also. So I'm glad you mentioned that it was one of your... I think visually coming in from the Palais and the kind of chaotic and the rave lighting in the Palais into the toilet sequence, which... It's just a fantastic contrast from one section, one part of the movie into the other, and then the fight sequence speaks for itself. What an amazing sequence! So, yeah, that was the bathroom was discussed in New Zealand. We had it semi pre-rigged and pre-lit before we arrived back from New Zealand, and when we walked in, like anything, you can and have to sometimes adapt and work with the DP if he's got something else in mind, and everyone is pretty pleased that we've done that now. The end result's cracking, I think.
And another one that I liked, because I'm old enough to remember the television series, is I guess the so-called mousetrap set, where walls come down, and the hospital room you think you're in is not where you are at all. Um, and so I'm thinking the ambiance of the lighting has to change from one to the other, kind of on the fly. How was that one put together from a lighting point of view?
Yeah, that was the first set we shot on arrival back from New Zealand, and let me tell you, I had sleepless nights over that set because the way it was constructed, it wasn't in a stage. We shot it down at an RAF base in one of their hangars, and I'd been in New Zealand. We had issues every day out there that we were obviously dealing with. When you're talking to a construction team and a wire team that are building a set and the walls have to collapse, but you also want to light the set, but you need to get your lights near enough, but not within danger of the walls falling down, but you're doing it remotely. That's when you rely back on your rigging gaffer back in the UK. And at the time, the first section of the UK before the hiatus, my rigging gaffer, Dave Ridout, was just the conduit for all of that communication with the departments. I sat with Rob and we designed a light box for him. Rob's a big fan of a Wendy light, but we didn't have we couldn't put the Wendy lights in the soft boxes. I decided that it would be better to use something a little bit more smaller. We use sun strips, which are banks of 75-watt dichroic tungsten light bulbs. No LED again. But I said to Rob, visually, when you're looking at the light box, it's going to look much nicer with banks of light, and it's another contrast from when you think you're in a hospital ward, prison type hospital ward. So the walls fall down. It's a better gag than just seeing the old 20k light kind of gag that's been done many times before. A bit of studio lighting that nobody really knows what it's doing, but it's a visual, it's a set deck piece. No, we wanted to actually put light boxes in that were actually lighting the set, and when the walls come down, they fade out, and you can see that they've been hung there. It's a big gag. The guy's been taken for a ride. He didn't know, and it's just such a nicer looking piece, I think, because once again, everything's neat, everything's uniform. Rob's and Peter Wenham's vision is always neatness, linear lines, and using the Sunbank soft boxes that we made. I think they were the big one was 30-foot across, and had probably 60 10 pod strips in it. And then we had two smaller ones off to the side. And then the practicals in the set were fluorescents again, but the right type of light with caged fittings to suit the environment of a secure military type hospital wing. And all that had to be carefully coordinated with the walls that come down. Some lights we had on the walls. Some of it was wireless and battery powered. Some of it was hardwired. But the biggest problem was coordinating with the special effects department and their wire control and how close we could get our boxes. In the end, I had to have our boxes rigged on I-beams that we could travel the boxes left and right for certain scenes and bring them in and out and up and down on obviously electronic hoists. So we had full control and range of our lighting keys. All in all, a few sleepless nights, but in the end, just having a fantastic rigging crew to communicate with, to do the groundwork and do the real long conversations, then the short conversations back to New Zealand every night. Obviously, my best boy, Lee Eldred's a huge asset to me. He sort of takes care of some of this, and then I can just come off set in the evenings and we have a meeting, maybe make a call back to the UK and build the sets that way.
And of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't get into, perhaps the biggest tour de force of the film, the skydiving sequence, which, if I understood correctly, Tom and the director insisted be shot for real, jumping out of an actual military plane. What was the role of lighting there?
Well, I remember sitting in a production meeting T minus a year from shooting that scene, and I'm sitting in the meeting and they're discussing the skydive sequence, and then they're talking about these helmets they're going to have designed, and they're going to be pressurized oxygen rich helmets. And the next breath, they're talking about having lights in the helmets. And so I had to stop the meeting there and I said, look, are we serious? We're going to be jumping at night and we're going to be putting light into the actors' eyes. So their eyes aren't going to adjust for the night landing zone. And they're basically, when they switch the lights off, they're going to be blind. Equally, we've got oxygen and heat and, fuel, really. Are we going to combust an LED light in their face? I don't know. It was a moment where I had to stop the meeting and say, look, we're a long way off. How are we making these? Who's testing these? What are we putting in? And the conversations from that moment on started to get serious. It turned out there's obviously a way to do everything. And our model maker, Toby Shears, made the helmets and helped me come up with a design where we could hide LED, and you see it quite apparent in the movie. Now, that wasn't born out of, let's just put a bit of LED in the helmets. That was several prototypes, positioning the lighting, showing Rob Hardy, showing Tom how the light reacts in his eyes. No, we don't like that. The light's not wrapping around the face. Then we'd add more diffusion, and it was all precast, modelled rubber mouldings, and we had to design the LED to actually fit around in that. We used some light ribbon, but it had to specifically fit. And then Rob would say, either it's still not bright enough, we need to get it brighter. How can we control it? What colours can we use? And over the course of a year, and it took a year to get to the end result, these helmets were, safe to use. They were sent off, the LED we used in it was sent off to a testing facility to test the LEDs in that oxygen-rich environment. And we had to prove that if there was a LED short circuit and it sparked, would it spark? Could it cause a fire? Would it be safe? Does it self-extinguish? And it was proof that, we were correct in using LED, and, it was pretty much signed off as 100% fail-safe. That's when we knew, we'd succeeded with this, this system. It was run off batteries. The batteries had to be in a special pouch that was stitched into the parachute harness itself, and the wires had to be stitched into the backing. In fact, when we got to Abu Dhabi, we hadn't considered where the wires would link from the battery pack to the helmet, and I sat for about 3 days stitching with our stitch master, Ray Armstrong, from the parachute regiment, ex-paratrooper. He sat there and helped me thread the cables through the back of everyone's parachute harnesses, and you're thinking to yourself, I'm actually tampering with a perfectly good parachute, and under the authorization of somebody that's qualified to do this, but it still feels slightly uncomfortable piercing the back of a parachute, threading the cables up through the back. It was a last-minute decision that they wanted to add some switches, so it was a safety decision we made that as they jump and it gets darker and the scene's over, before they land, they can switch the lights off in the helmet. So we had to retrofit some switches onto the front harness part of the parachute holdall. Ray helped me do that, stitch these in. But it was a team collaboration. My practicals guy, Steve, made the LED lights with Toby Shears, the model maker. They came up with the clever way of fitting it in. And after much testing, we got a great end result that wraps enough light round into the actor's face, but, we're not blinding them. And indeed, they had this facility to turn them on and off. But it's the length and the time and the precision and all the meetings that go into these things that need to be right. It is a collaboration. And then I'd start bouncing around about safety. And my main concerns on any set is safety, first and foremost. From safety, you then have to make it practical. And once you've got, safety and practical, then you can make it visual and work for the shot. And not until all those three elements come together do you have a real, end result. And indeed, the helmet was one of those collaborations that we needed all three items to come together. And it took a year. It took a year to get there.
Another cool scene that impressed me when Tom Cruise and his cohorts are trying to escape through an underground water canal tunnel under the streets of Paris. I think it's the Canal Saint Martin. I think it's called. There's lighting streaming in from above ground, and you had to sort of choreograph and establish all of that throughout the streets of Paris above. What was involved with that?
Well, I remember the recce clearly. We all sat in a boat, and of course we travel up the canal, and everyone's in awe of this amazing canal built by Napoleon, or whatever many years ago. And we're travelling up, and Rob's looking up, going, "We can put a light here, we can put a light here, we can put a light here." It's a mile long, or it's nearly a mile long, and there's probably 30 odd air vents, or they're probably 12 feet across, and they're in pairs, and you can see it's quite apparent in the movie. And it's all very easy as you're travelling up under a canal, thinking it's just meadowland above, and you can park generators and tech trucks, and nobody cares about that. They're just picking holes where they want lights. And of course, I'm now thinking, right, I need to really scout above ground. I'm not really too fussed what's below ground. The end section, we put, I think it was 500 foot, once again, of fluorescent lighting that just gives it an amazing end part to that sequence as the boat pulls in and they escape up the stairs. There's a great linear. We've gone circles, we've gone tunnel, and then we've gone linear with the lighting, once again, to keep in our format. But then I took a deep breath. Everyone goes, and we go back and scout it as an electrical team, rigging team, and then we realise that it is through the centre of Paris, and there's some park, but there's some roads. How are we actually going to do this? They're not going to give us 2 weeks prep, but once again, I want to use some powerful HMI lighting, but we're not going to be able to. We need to use tungsten Wendy lights corrected with blue, and we ended up, I think it was 6 quarter Wendy lights through each hole and a mole beam, of which we didn't do all the holes in the end, but we'd done a very big section in the middle of 10 holes, and then at the end a section of 6 holes. But that covers, best part of half a kilometre, and each hole has to have, because the amount of lighting we're putting in it, its own generator plant and its own truss rigging. So we came up with a plan where we'd have a rigging crew come in 2 days before to some of the areas. Each hole would have its own truck, generator, and equipment on it. We'd break it down into a crew per 2 holes, 2 air vents. And so over the course of 2 days, we managed to rig 16 of these holes above on truss. And, some of the lights were on stands. The high ones were on truss rigs. We couldn't get genie booms in. We couldn't get, cranes in. There wasn't the space. We had to cable quite carefully. Obviously, these areas some of them are residential, some of them are parkland, some are the middle of a road. So it was a very carefully coordinated lighting installation that was planned meticulously with the locations department. They were fantastic in achieving it.
I didn't know if lighting had to be a big challenge or issue related to the giant uh, car and truck chase scene through the streets of Paris around the Arc de Triomphe and all that kind of stuff. I know there's a part of that sequence where a police van is dumped in the drink and sinks, and there's an underwater scene there. I assume that was done tank work. Was that did that pose a lot of work for you guys, or because most of it was shot, in daylight exterior? Did not have to drive you too crazy?
Well, we shot that sequence obviously coming out, the helicopter lands, and that's where that sequence starts. Early on we decided we were going to have to use LED lighting in the back of the police truck. Not so much because that's the only lighting we could use for that part of the chase, but obviously when it goes into the river, we need to have the ability to make it safe. So we want to use low voltage LED lighting panels that could go in. But the sequence actually, as it comes under the covered way, just before it's rammed into the water, that sequence we lit. There's a flare. We had some mole beams, and as the impact happens, we've got some light, some Wendy lights pushing in as a key on Tom and Henry, just enhancing what the sun's doing, bouncing in off the river. Then it cuts to the tank. Now, the tank itself was shot Warner Brothers D stage. That was a colossal lighting rig for us. We had to, Rob didn't want to use sky panels, didn't want to use LED. So we rigged flow bank, 8-bank fluorescent light flow banks. They called different things in different countries, ARRI light flows. So we rigged a huge softbox in D stage, and D stage isn't particularly friendly to rigging. It's got a sloped end, so we managed to do a 60 by 60 feet textile diffusion that was on separate hoists, so we could really soften and lose some of the reflections by lowering up and down. And above that, we had another 60 by 60 with 80 of these mixed color tube flow banks. That was the only way I could control the color temperature. Obviously, Rob didn't want to use sky panels, so I color temped with a 3,200, then a 5,600, and alternated throughout the flow bank. So I could put 3 of one color and 2 of another on and try and get the color temperatures needed using fluorescent lighting. And that traveled up and down as well. So we had full control from above, but we also built soft boxes with space lights, tungsten space lights. You just want to put sky panels in these boxes these days, but we had to stick to the rules. And so we built 30 feet by 8 feet high, 8 feet deep soft boxes. And I put them on travelling I-beam so I could pull them up and down the stage. And we put one on all 4 sides just to wrap the skyline round. And for some of the harder light, we had mole beams positioned all around the tank, all back to our dimmer control. So there were three parts of the truck that went into the tank. We done the flop over rig, as it was called. We done the rolling rig as the truck sinks, and we done the rig at the bottom of the tank. And so we had to have the ability to light that depending on which set we were on. The hardest part of it, the most complex part, was as the lights, as they dropped down in the tank, we needed to get the lights to flicker as the electrical circuits short out or fail. But of course, we couldn't hardwire any of it because the rig rotates and flips. So we didn't want to connect anything. We wanted all the lights inside of the truck to work off batteries. But there lies a problem. You can't transmit data through water. So we had to come up with a clever way of transmitting a lighting sequence on a timer. So just, they do the action, and just before it sinks, we'd send a data signal to our receiver that was all enclosed in waterproof enclosures. And then the timer would start. And as it sinks, the timing we'd set depending 15, 20 seconds, and then the lights would flicker and fail. We had to have that control because sometimes the sequence was delayed depending on how the action worked up top. But, something simple like that can catch you out. You think you're hardwiring, you go to shoot it, and then the effects guys are saying nothing's being connected to this rig as it goes in. So we had to think again outside the box. I mean, it was a big rig in there. It was a big rig. We had underwater lighting. We had some 5K pars that we bounced into some underwater grifflons and some underwater cleaner flow to light some of the green screens in the tank. But once again, it's a safety first element. I had an underwater gaffer, Aaron Keating, who looked after all the underwater safety elements. We had Dave Ridout, my rigging gaffer, rigged that stage. We had it all tested to our BS standard 7909, and to make sure any equipment going into the tanks protected on not a 30 milliamp but a 15 milliamp protection device, and a residual current device. So all this had to be tested and signed before anyone was allowed in the tank. And then we had full control over any departments that thought they were bringing in equipment into our wet zone, as we call it, or our 0 zone or our zone 1, which has to be completely protected on our own circuit devices. And so, it was broken down into sections once again, but professionally done and managed, and safety first, then lighting second, and then visual third, really. And it all came together. It was achieved quite well, I think.
Well, I think the whole thing was achieved quite well, and we are running out of time, and there is more we could get to, but I think this certainly gives folks the flavor of the nature of the challenge. But I thought, just to conclude, your thoughts on what you learned on this show, not only creatively how to light action and work with these filmmakers and that kind of stuff, but also just from a department management sort of point of view, paperwork, budgets, customs, etc. The business side of being a gaffer on a project of this nature. What you learn that you will take forward to the next one and the next one, and make you better at what you do.
The biggest thing that I kind of knew, but we on something of this scale is budgeting for the amount of labour that you're going to have on a show like this. And we built a spreadsheet on the movies, previous to this, where you'd have labour flow, but this was something far more complex. We had to have labour flow not only for the UK and the UK rigging and the UK rigging electric grips, as you call them, but ours are riggers, scaffolders. We had to have that for moving forward for New Zealand. We had to have that moving forward for Abu Dhabi and Norway. And if I could show you my labour flow for that, it's pages long, and the end total of something like that, I don't want to say on the phone, but it's an immense amount. And when you break it down and you can show to the producers, this is where the costs are. This is highlighting some of the bigger rigs like the 60-man rig at the Palais. You need to have the answers, and you need to know the costs from start to finish of the movie without the curveballs that obviously come on movies. You need to have within a 10% sort of range a fully budgeted estimate on labour flow. And that has just, from the last 10 years, that has grown into a much, much bigger part of being a gaffer. And it's always, the start of any movie, you start to talk about numbers, equipment costs, and labour flow. And for me, I learned much more about how to structure the labour flow, how to move the numbers around, how to try and box clever with some locations and reduce labour on some of the smaller locations. What's the minimum amount of crew we need to carry? Who are we employing, and what are their rates in the different countries? It all has to be broken down as a man per man day, per man cost, including hotels and per diems and food. That's now a lot more onto a gaffer's shoulders, where 10 years ago you would just say, we're taking this team and we're going to take a truck full of lights and make a film. And over the last 10 years, including a immense practical element that's never budgeted, in my opinion, quite properly on a movie, is that coming out of set decks budget, art department's budget? Is it electric budget? In my opinion, it's a three-way split that's never quite structured properly. And at the end of it, this whole structure of looking after budgets and satisfying the producers to showing them where the numbers are and why you need the numbers, that's the biggest part that I'll take out of this movie. I learned so much about how to budget for this sort of size and scope and amount of man days. And now we have much better systems moving forward for the next movie. Also, the scale of this movie and how you treat people in different countries to get the best results, and how you adapt to their system, although you're keeping your own health and safety departments informed and achieving their goals and the risk assessments, how you can adapt that to make it work in other countries, and how you use all these key players to make the end result fantastic and the best result for the producers and the directors' vision and the DP's vision. That's always a learning element when you go and shoot in any country, how you react with the different styles and different ideas. You've got to be open to other people's ideas and opinions, and if you're not, you're going to fall flat on your face and not get the best end result. So it's every day is a learning curve for me.
So there you have it, folks. It's not all just sexy fun and games, globetrotting the world, but if you watch the end result, I think it's certainly worth it for those who enjoy action films and high end filmmaking. So, Martin, with that said, we wanted to thank you for joining us today on the podcast. It's quite an achievement, and we wish you a lot of luck with it.
That's great, and thanks for having us on. It's not every day you get invited to come and have a chat and maybe try and portray some of your feelings and emotions that have happened on a movie like this. So yeah, thanks for your time. Thanks very much.
And that was another Studio Daily podcast from the front lines. My conversation with Gaffer Martin Smith about the lighting challenges posed by the new Tom Cruise action thriller Mission Impossible Fallout. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch your inbox every month for more newsletters directing you to our monthly podcasts covering the art, science, and people involved in the world of feature filmmaking. I'm Michael Goldman. Have a great day.